The past century has witnessed an explosion of innovation covering nearly every facet of human experience. Just 150 years ago, the most sophisticated form of transportation was the locomotive. Now, a lucky few of us have even left footprints on the surface of the moon. These technological advancements are easy to recognize. However, less recognizably, the arts, as well, have expanded exponentially. Just as the locomotive marks this crossover from antiquity to modernity, so too do the works of modernists such as James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. Perhaps this crossover is most evident in Einstein's theory of relativity. Though it is quite difficult to understand, the scientific implications of this new way of thinking, the artistic, social, and psychological effects are much clearer. All things are relative. In the quest to classify information, the English language itself has grown immensely, but this has not rendered sexuality with working definitions. One thing that modern art and modern understandings of sexuality have in common is ambiguity. This, too, is one of the defining characteristics of Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. Filled with allusions to modernism, particularly James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Bechdel's graphic novel is as much the story of Bechdel's coming out as it is a representation of what it means to be queer in a world which lacks suitable definitions for that experience. It is fitting, therefore, that Bechdel draws from modernists, who were equally concerned with identity and innovation, in order to present what I hesitantly will classify as a queer narrative. My hesitation to classify Fun Home as a queer narrative stems from the trap of classification. While labels allow us to continue to share and explore new ideas in a common vocabulary, they also serve to exclude from definition that which they also are. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick addresses a similar point in Epistemology of the Closet when she writes, "It should be clear that there are certain distortions necessarily built into the relation of gay, lesbian, and anti-homophobic theory to a larger project of conceiving a theory of sexuality as a whole. The two can, after all, scarcely be coextensive, and this is true not because gay, lesbian, and anti-homophobic theory would fail to cover heterosexual as well as same-sex object choice, any more than feminist theory would fail to cover men as well as women, but rather because, as we have noted, sexuality extends along so many dimensions that aren't well described in terms of gender object choice at all. Just as there are distortions arising from using queer theory to examine sexuality as a whole, so too does the label of queer narrative fail to account for all of the other facets of Bechdel's work. So to classify Bechdel's text as a queer narrative is to risk interpreting it solely as such. Indeed, Fun Home might just as easily be classified as family drama, or family tragicomic, or autobiographical fiction, or, in perhaps the most general of terms, fiction. Bechdel faces similar problems of definition when she tries to define her father's sexuality. Perhaps my eagerness to claim him as gay in the way I am gay, as opposed to bisexual or some other category, is just a way of keeping him to myself, a sort of inverted Oedipal complex. Thus, the question of Fun Home's genre is similar to the very questions regarding sexuality that the book raises. Furthermore, to leave Fun Home unclassified would result in the sort of ambiguity and uncertainty of meaning which, ironically, is an essential element of queerness. In order to define Fun Home as a queer narrative, in part, I must define queer. It may seem pejorative or odd to refer to a certain studies of sexuality as queer theory, but in the introduction to the gender studies section of Blackwell's Literary Anthology, editors Julie Rivkin and Michael Ryan explain that this is a way of reclaiming the word. Queer theory adopted a term of stigmatization, queer being a derogatory name for a gay or lesbian person, and turned it against the perpetrator by transforming it into a token of pride. While the word queer is more inclusive than the word homosexual, in that it includes everything which is not straight, it still suffers from the creation of a false binary between straight, and how shall we define that, and queer. Nonetheless, these words are at least the beginning of a more complete understanding of human sexuality. It is important to have some word to describe alternative sexualities because names determine and strengthen or weaken cultural exchanges. As Pierre Bourdieu writes in Distinction, the fate of groups is bound up with words that designate them. The power to impose recognition depends on the capacity to mobilize around a name. proletariat, working class, cadres, etc., to appropriate a common name and to commune in a proper name, and so to mobilize the union that makes them strong around the unifying power of a word. It would be ludicrous to abandon the task of defining things. How would we know when to meet for lunch without definitions of time? And it is in fact useful to have terms which describe sexuality, however limited those terms may be. In her attempts to understand her experiences and discover her identity, Bechdel refers to the dictionary, entries from which she reproduces by hand much in the same way that she reproduces photographic evidence. She notes that her father's death was queer in every sense of that multivalent word, and proceeds to describe how each definition from the dictionary applies to that event. With regard to her sexuality as well as that of her father, the dictionary is no help. She finds that, most compellingly at the time, his death was bound up for me with the one definition that was conspicuously missing from our mammoth Websters. In the sense that I am using the word queer, and the sense for which Bechdel was searching, queer necessarily involves sexuality and/or gender, particularly the ambiguities of such. Later, however, she realizes she is a lesbian when she discovers the definition in another dictionary. Still, this is of less help than the interview she reproduces below, in which Elsa states, "I never understood what that means, because as far as I'm concerned, I was born that way." The significance here is the failure of definitions to accurately describe things. They are metaphors, maps with which we must be careful not to confuse the terrain. As Bechdel discovers, experience or narrative is significantly more helpful. After reading scores of texts on sexuality, she concludes, "My researches were stimulating but solitary. It became clear I was going to have to leave this academic plane and enter the human fray." Having learned what has been written about lesbianism, Bechdel must at that point venture forth and discover for herself what her particular brand of queer is. Fun Home addresses much more than Bechdel's sexuality. It is at least as much a story of her father's sexuality and death, which appear to be wrapped up in each other. As Bechdel puts it, intentional, accidental, it was un mort imbécile. Any way you looked at it. Pardon my French. This callback to the story of Albert Camus dying in a car accident is another reference to the artistry that will eventually give Bechdel some outlet for her thoughts and feelings. But occurring as it did just 3 weeks after Bechdel comes out to her parents, and just 3 days short of F. Scott Fitzgerald's lifespan, it has even broader implications if it was intentional. For a wild moment I entertained the idea that my father had timed his death with this in mind, as some sort of deranged tribute, but that would only confirm that his death was not my fault, that in fact it had nothing to do with me at all. Her father may have been paying tribute to an author with whom he shared the preference of a fiction to reality, given that her father's fiction was that he was comfortable living as a devoted husband and father. But he was not devoted, and though he was active with the children, they were not a physically expressive family. This fictional life represented a conflict of ideologies, which is perhaps what led him to take his own life. Aside from the legal injustices of a homophobic culture, Bechdel wonders at one point, if the cops search for me, could I pass the 3 articles of women's clothing rule? The punishment for being queer is often violent. In The History of Sexuality, Michel Foucault recounts, "For a long time, hermaphrodites were criminals, or crime's offspring, since their anatomical disposition, their very being, confounded the law that distinguished the sexes and prescribed their union. Still today, there are far too many stories of men and women being attacked and occasionally beaten to death for living an alternative lifestyle. One can hardly blame an individual for wanting to hide their sexuality or gender differences. Bechdel's father, like Daedalus, constructs the maze from which he must escape. His maze is the house in which they live, which is an artifice, a literal yet false construction of his environment to represent a family lifestyle. Unfortunately, this closeting comes with a hefty cost. In Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Louis Althusser writes, "Indeed, if he does not do what he ought to do as a function of what he believes, it is because he does something else, which, still is a function of the same idealist scheme, implies that he has other ideas in his head as well as those he proclaims, and that he acts accordingly to these other ideas, as a man who is either inconsistent, no one is willingly evil, or cynical or perverse. Who among us is not inconsistent? And while cynicism may leave an individual feeling generally bitter, it is this perversity that traumatizes the psyche. This perversity can only be truly measured by the individual himself. Eventually, Bechdel's father becomes existentially dissatisfied with this double life, and he seeks therapy from a psychiatrist. Whether they discussed his sexuality is not explicitly stated, and when Bechdel asks him why he needs therapy, he responds, "I'm bad, not good like you." Therefore, it is not that he is objectively perverse, if such a thing as objective perversity even exists. Rather, it is that he is perverse from his own perspective, which creates his mental anguish. At her father's wake, a panel shows how she would like to respond to those who attempt to console her with the useless cliché that the Lord moves in mysterious ways, while the next panel shows her more diplomatic response. Though her father tells Bechdel that she is good, he has frequently chastised her for experiencing similar crises of gender and sexuality to those he has kept hidden. When Bechdel recognizes a piece of her own identity in a butch truck driver, her father asks, "Is that what you want to look like?" And in the face of this admonishment, she denies her feelings, telling him no. Thus, Bechdel's father passes on the shame of his sexuality to his daughter, an act that is perhaps another aspect of the logic behind his possible suicide. But as Anne Setkovich writes, Bechdel offers no simple answers to these questions, thus avoiding the pieties that can sometimes accompany a cultural politics of witnessing that would encourage us to sympathize with her father as a victim of history, whose problems could be solved by our retrospective enlightenment. Although Alison certainly gestures toward this version of historical contextualization, she also refuses to settle for it definitively. Maybe I'm trying to render my senseless loss meaningful by linking it, however posthumously, to a more coherent narrative, a narrative of injustice, sexual shame, and fear, of life considered expendable. There's a certain emotional expedience to claiming him as a tragic victim of homophobia, but that's a problematic line of thought. For one thing, it makes it harder for me to blame him. Just as her father's sexuality is ambiguous and complex, so too are the reasons behind his possible suicide. Though Bechdel frames Fun Home in such a way as to highlight her father's sexuality, his character, both in and out of the story, is not one-dimensional. Indeed, it is Bechdel's father who first acquaints her with the tools she will eventually use to resolve her identity confusion. She begins to keep a journal, an activity which no doubt prepared her to chronicle her life artistically in much the same way that her father's literary heroes used autobiographical details to construct a narrative. Introduced to the genre by her father, who initially gives her an advertising calendar to write in, the diaries connect her to the high culture literary world of Joyce, Proust, and other writers to which her father, the high school English teacher and frustrated artist, aspires. But they are also part of the culture of young girls in the 1960s and 1970s who did not necessarily think they were making art. Using the graphic novel as her medium, Bechdel is able to transcend the limitations of words. Jennifer Lemberg writes of this transcendence in an essay for Women's Studies Quarterly, in which she writes, "As Bechdel demonstrates how writing becomes almost impossible for her, however, she offers several examples of the way in which drawing seems capable of filling the gap between language and its subject. What remains unspeakable in her family and unrepresented in her diary can be at least partially represented through images. While she does not articulate precisely how or why this is so, she consistently privileges drawing as a more direct mode of representation." Consider the pages Bechdel refers to as the centerfold. Bechdel provides plenty of narration to explain the significance of her father's photograph of Roy. However, the image of her reproduction conveys more than words can. After all, her father kept the photograph because he wanted to look at it. It was not a poem or a literary description of what made Roy beautiful, and for readers to truly understand what he saw, the readers must see the image for themselves. Though the image may be seen as erotic, it is not pornography per se. Rather, it shows an aesthetic appreciation of the body which might not be acknowledged by those who only see the body as sexual. More to the point, The stigma of homosexuality includes a faulty perception of unchecked libido, which pigeonholes gay men as being concerned only with the sexual aspects of the body. The fear of queerness, therefore, prevents the homophobic individual from seeing Roy's beauty. Thus, Bechdel's rendering of the photograph forces her readers to examine their own views of sexuality. Bechdel's drawing of Roy has all of the ambiguity typical of a modernist novel, and it has the beauty of the ordinary which the modernists sought to portray. Although the intrusion of her narration is uncharacteristic of modernism, she learns from the modernists how art can liberate the soul. The simplicity of her story, the minutiae, and the ordinariness find their justification in the aesthetics of modernism. In a speech later published in print on the aesthetic ideals of modernism, Virginia Woolf writes, "Examine for a moment an ordinary mind and an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. From all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms, and as they fall, as they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday, the accent falls differently from of old. The moment of importance came not here but there, so that if a writer were a free man and not a slave, if he could write what he chose, not what he must, if he could base his work upon his feeling and not upon convention, there would be no plot, no comedy, no tragedy, no love interest or catastrophe in the accepted style, and perhaps not a single button sewn on as the Bond Street tailors would have it." What Woolf expresses in these statements is the modernist desire to be free of traditional narrative, to be free to write in a way that conveys the complexities of life without having to conform to expected notions of narrative. This freedom is exactly what Bechdel and her father are seeking with regard to their sexuality. They both want to know who they are, but without the definitions their society imposes on them. While Fun Home has a relationship with many modernist novels, it is particularly comparable to A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Aside from the obvious literary references to James Joyce's novel, Bechdel's narrative also takes a similar form, particularly in the reworking of the Daedalus and Icarus myth, which Joyce uses to describe the artist's rite of passage. In fact, when her father learns that she is reading Portrait, he tells her, "Good, you damn well better identify with every page." It is likely that he was aware of the similarities between the journey she would soon undertake and that of Stephen Dedalus and, in other ways, James Joyce. Like James Joyce, Stephen Dedalus, Bechdel's story is a modernist Bildungsroman. According to James Castle in an article in James Joyce Quarterly, the modernist Bildungsroman represents the failure of classical Bildung in this institutional climate, but it also maps new points of resistance in the process of formation and encourages the emergence of new conceptions of self-formation that are more often concerned with evading and resisting socialization, with disharmonious social spheres or with hybrid, ambivalent, sometimes traumatic processes of identity formation. Whereas Joyce was concerned with forging a modern aesthetic free from tradition, Bechdel seeks to help establish a tradition, one of tolerance and individual sexuality. Both face adversity, Joyce in his obscenity battles over Ulysses, and Bechdel in the unequal laws that govern most modern societies. One considerable difference between Joyce and Bechdel is that Joyce was concerned solely with his own mode of aesthetics. His story is arguably the story of his own development as an artist, and it ends with his expatriation. Bechdel's book, on the other hand, speaks for millions of individuals worldwide who want to be accepted into society without having to sacrifice any claims to their own sense of identity. In Sexual Transformations, Gail Rubin writes, "The New Guinea bachelor and the sodomite nobleman are only tangentially related to a modern gay man, who may migrate from rural Colorado to San Francisco in order to live in a gay neighborhood, work in gay business, and participate in an elaborate experience that includes a self-conscious identity, group solidarity, a literature, a press, and a high level of political activity. In modern Western industrial societies, homosexuality has acquired much of the institutional structure of an ethnic group. If homosexuality or queerness in general can be considered the integral feature of an ethnic group, then Fun Home, as a novel which speaks to the recurring conditions of members of the LGBTQ+ community, can be viewed as a queer narrative." Over the last century, humankind has raced forward with new ideas that have both reified and reshaped traditional values. Fun Home is a brilliant novel which embraces the modernist ethos of forging new traditions, of finding new tools for a modern age. But Bechdel's novel also shows the need for tradition and the effects that the denial of a culture or the exclusion from tradition can have on minority ethnic groups, specifically the LGBTQ+ or queer community. By writing a narrative that reflects the values and experiences of this oppressed minority, however diverse and complex they are, Alison Bechdel's Fun Home establishes a discourse within which others who cannot speak may be heard.